Good day, ENGL 221 students. Welcome back. I hope you had a relaxing long weekend and that you got to spend some time on Women's Day with all of the important women in your life. As is our custom, we begin this week, of course, with a message from the Word of the Lord. And since we are discussing poetry this week, I thought it would be a good idea to read a famous poem and a very beautiful poem from the Bible. And we find this in Psalm 23. And I ask that you bow your heads and I will read this poem to us as a prayer. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. For thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As I mentioned before, we are looking at poetry, at some poetic elements this week. There are 3 poems that you will study also, and those will be self-study, and then I will provide the memorandum of those poems for you on eClass. As for your semester assignment, although we are not going to discuss it in detail again in this study unit, please just note the most important details again. It has been discussed in previous lectures. Please remember you must submit it electronically on Turnitin with the AROS assignment cover page. You will remember that submissions have already opened. So if you are ready and if you've done your assignment, you can already submit. Please note if your similarity percentage is higher than 20%, you will need to make some changes and resubmit. And very important, all submissions to be done by the 3rd of September at 11 at night. No late submissions will be accepted. This then brings us to today's lecture where we will be studying we will be studying poetry. You'll notice that we are still busy with study unit 4. Last week was also study unit form 4, but we then discussed short stories. Now we are going to discuss poetry and poetic devices. What is the outcome and the assessment criteria of this lecture? We want to revise basic knowledge of poetry and poetic terms and devices. I want you to be able to interpret and evaluate a poem by using various techniques of poetic analysis. And then I also want you to appreciate the value of poetry in your foundation phase classroom. Now the question arises, why do we teach poetry in schools? And I must tell you, as a language teacher, poetry has always been one of my favorite things to teach children because I really do enjoy poetry and love it. But why do we teach poetry to children? Poetry broadens reading choices, as there are numerous excellent poetic picture books and poetry collections. So it just gives you as a teacher a wider choice of the books you want to share with children, because there really are very, very excellent picture books with poems and poetry collections that you can use in your class and that you can introduce to your learners. Poetry, of course, also builds a love for reading with children. Children, as we know, have a natural curiosity. They always want to explore and find out new things. And through poetry, you can foster and encourage this natural curiosity in your learners. It creates wonder in a child's mind. There really is not a single child that I've come across who does not love and enjoy poetry, especially your learners in the foundation phase. Poems encourage kids to imagine new worlds and experiences. And remember, it is exactly this imagination that will also help them later on when they have to start writing creative pieces. Poetry is wonderful to share with the children, but it is also very important that you have it available for them to choose and read independently in your class. Poems provide enjoyment and laughter. Poems are engaging and fun to read, and they also encourage kids to move with the rhythms they hear and to add actions. Now, poetry as a piece of literature is very condensed and very purposeful, and even more so the poems that you will be teaching in your foundation phase class or the poems that you will be reading with your learners. This distilled form of writing naturally focuses on sentence level skills. This means that you don't even have to plan very much to teach your learners the skills they will need to make sentences of their own. Just by using poetry, you are naturally teaching them how to write sentences and how to recognize sentences. Why? Because with its purposeful selection, with a poem's purposeful selection of adjectives, adverbs, powerful verbs, and specific nouns, this happens naturally. Remember, a poem is never just something that rhymes. There's a purpose behind every single word. Every single line of poetry is teaching your learners something. Look at the two examples we have here, Jack be nimble and Jack and Jill. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. Now there's many things that your learners will learn from this Jack be nimble poem. One of them could be alliteration, for example. Let's look at Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Up Jack got and home did trot as fast as he could caper, went to bed to mend his head with vinegar and brown paper. And again, it's not just a nice poem to read and with a good rhythm, it's especially that rhythm in Jack and Jill that will also naturally teach your learners sentence level skills. Now with poetry, of course, you also explore language and vocabulary. Poetry often contains words that rhyme for certain effect. Your learners will learn about phonics and letter sounds by listening for and locating rhyming words. A poem can be used to teach sentence structure, parts of speech, and many other grammar and language skills. And poetry also builds vocabulary. Now, poetry also picks up on new skills that your learners have acquired. That's why poetry is a perfect writing form for you to study with your class immediately after a holiday break, because it is that exactly then when your students will show progress in the quality of their written and their spoken communication. Now, of course, with poetry, language skills are developed, but even more important are the reading skills and the listening skills and the speaking skills that are encouraged and strengthened when we read poetry with our learners and when we also allow them to discover it for themselves. It actually allows the dots to be connected in a child's brain when they see, hear, and say the poems out loud. Rachel Clark, a teacher herself, says that as teachers, when we use poetry with children, we are modeling how to read it, building familiarity with it, and widening children's reading horizons. And you can read a bit more about what Rachel Clark had to say about poetry in the article. I have posted the web page there for you. The article is called 5 Reasons to Include Poetry in Your Classroom. It really makes for excellent reading. Please, if you can find the time, read that article. Have a look at the very fun poem, popcorn that you can do with your learners. Pop, pop, popcorn, popping in the pot. Pop, pop, popcorn, eat it while it's hot. Pop, pop, popcorn, butter on the top. When I eat popcorn, I can't stop. Now, this poem also gives you an idea of another very important feature of poetry, and that is that it uses less words. And being such a small number of written words, poetry is often less intimidating for writers and speakers new to English. So if you have learners in your class and they don't feel very comfortable using English, try to use poetry because it's such a small number of words that they are very often quite willing to try to read English or then speak English if it is a poem. And along with storytelling, it will give your English as an additional language learners an excellent first opportunity to write English and then orally share their writing with the class. So it's always a very good idea to have your learners write their own poetry and then share it with the class. Now, poetry also encourages creative thinking in learners. It can have a positive impact on the social and emotional learning of children. It may offer them a new way of thinking about something. It can put things into words that children in your class may not know how to express otherwise. And poetry also encourages children to express themselves and their feelings. Let's have a look at the poem there on the right-hand side. The poem is called Water. Water is clearly a mystery to me. A solid, a liquid, a gas. It's all three. Freeze it, warm it, boil it, you'll see. Water is clearly a mystery to me. And poetry being so broad is exactly what makes it so appealing to your learners, because they can write their poetry about absolutely any subject. They can write about personal experiences or concepts, emotions, facts. They can write poems on any of these for you in class, and you can also share poems on any of these topics with them to read in class. Poetry will inspire writing in your learners. Because poetry is often in foundation phase so simple and there are such simple language patterns in the poems, they're also fun to follow, and it's a great place for children to start learning how to write, and it will inspire your learners to write. Writing poetry is a transferable skill that will help children write in other ways and styles. And what that means is that the skills that your learners learn when you allow them to write short little poems, they will be able to use those skills later on when they have to start writing longer sentences, paragraphs, essays. So it's not just a fun activity, it really is a very important activity skill-wise. A good poetry writing unit will include planning and brainstorming activities. So you will not just allow your learners to start and write a poem, you will encourage them to plan first and do some brainstorming. There will be templates to practice and write, so you will give them a poem template that they can use to practice on, and you will also allow for ways to display the poetry once they have written it. As a foundation phase teacher, a good and a fun way to introduce poetry to your learners is by using poetry games. And there are a lot of games you can use. For example, they must think of rhymes for objects that they see in class or on their way to school or at break time. And the sillier the rhyme that they make up, the better. Also, they could say a phrase to their partner or to the little boy or girl sitting next to them, and that partner then has to respond with a rhyming phrase. Challenge your learners to speak in rhyme for an entire day, even if it means they have to make up words. Now, I would really want this module to be practical for you with things that you can use. So I have also included 2 websites for you where you can find a plethora of poetry games to use in your classroom. Another poetry activity that you could use in your class and that the learners really find interesting and they will find it a lot of fun. You can have the learners in your class pick out a word from a hat. You select one learner and they pick out a word from a hat, and they must then describe the images and thoughts that come into their head when they read that word out loud. So for example, if your learner were to pick a word such as tree, they could describe it. They could say it is a tall tree, or it is a very small tree, a young tree. It's green with pink flowers, or it has acorns on it. There's birds that live in it, or it's brown and leafy. Um, Whatever words come to mind, the idea is to get them talking about that word. Another activity you could use is to write poetry strips, or to use poetry strips that you write single words on. You write single words on bits of paper to create free verse poems. So you get a group of learners together and they take turns picking out words from a hat, and they must then use these words in their poem. So for example, if a particular group picked these words from a hat, try, love, bread, head, rain, and yellow, they must then use those words in their poem. And it is really a fun activity to get them writing poetry. Once your learners are a bit more confident and they start writing poems, you can also introduce them to different kinds of poems. Let's look at a haiku. Now, haiku is a traditional Japanese form of poetry. And it is a good idea for you to try to get your learners to write different kinds of poems that have specific rules around them. And a haiku is a very easy example of such a poem. It will be easy for your learners to do, but there are very specific rules on what a haiku is and what it should look like. Haikus are three-lined poems. They do not rhyme. So it's 3 lines of unrhymed poetry, and they have a certain number of syllables in each line. Remember, a syllable in Afrikaans it is called lettergrepe. So that there are specific numbers of syllables in each line. 5, 7, and 5 respectively. Look at the example there. There's your 3 lines. It is unrhymed poetry. It's a traditional Japanese kind of poetry writing. The first line has 5 syllables or 5 lettergrepe. Second line 7 syllables, and the fifth line 5 syllables again. Refreshing and cool, love is a sweet summer rain that washes the world. Now, once your learners are a little bit more proficient in their poetry writing and they can write some excellent haikus, you could also introduce them to kennings, which is another specific type of poetry writing with very specific rules. Kennings enrich poetry using a 2-word phrase in the place of a 1-word noun. If you look at that example, you will see that every line is basically made up of a 2-word or a two-word phrase. And this is also a very old kind of poetry writing that we can already find in the Anglo-Saxon language. That is very old English, and also in Norse poetry writing. Norse poetry writing is Viking poetry writing. So it's not a new thing. Let's look at this excellent example here. A worm eater, a nest maker, a cushion filler, a seed muncher, a fish guzzler, a fast flyer, a cat escaper, a tree liver, an acrobatic glider, an adventurous swooper, a tweeting singer. Put these together. I'm a bird. Then we also have the ABC type poems, which learners really enjoy, and it also enforces the alphabet skills that they have. ABC poems use a letter of the alphabet to start each line with. So use these in your class and see how far through the alphabet your learners can get. There is a very nice example. ABCs of friendship. Always be honest, be there when they need you, cheer them on, don't look for their faults. Every chance you get, call. Forgive them, get together often, have faith in them, include them, just listen. Know their dreams, love them unconditionally, make them feel special, never forget them, offer to help, praise them honestly, quietly disagree, rescue them often, say you're sorry, talk frequently, use good judgment, vote for them, wish them good luck, x-ray yourself first, your words count, zip your mouth when necessary. So you can see it's a lot of fun. So pick a topic and then ask your learners to write the ABCs of that topic and see how far they get if they are able to use the entire alphabet. Young learners in your class always seem to very much enjoy the shape poems. Now, a shape poem will really stretch your learners' creativity when they try to write one themselves. And it is either written about a specific shape or it takes on the shape of an object that is associated with the topic of the poem. If you look at that first example, the poem is about rain and then it is in the shape of an umbrella. And that object, the umbrella, is associated with the topic of the poem, which was rain. In the second example, the poem is about a circle. It also starts with the sentence, I am a little circle, and you can see that it has been written in the shape of a circle. Some other activities you can do with your learners in your poetry class is to compare modern day poems with much older poems. So pick out poems written centuries ago by poets such as John Donne, Lord Byron, or William Blake, and then compare them to poems that have been written today, or let's say in the last 20 years. And you can find some of these recent poems and recent poetry prize winners at the Poetry Society. I have included the link there for you. And then ask your learners whether they notice any differences in the writing style, in the words that the poet used, and so on. Of course, one of the best activities to do with your learners is to read poems to them and to let them listen to you reading. Now, you could either read a collection of children's poems out loud, Michael Rosen, Roald Dahl, Shel Silverstein, and I quite like Ken Nesbitt. He's an American poet, but they are all great child-friendly poets to start with. Or you could even borrow a treasury of verse from the library, a book of verse from the local municipal library. And even if your school has a library, the school that you teach at, you could borrow such a book. Invest in a book of verse for yourself, for your learners. You will use it for many years to come. So it's always a good idea to buy one yourself. Then what you could also do is the Amazing Children's Poetry Archive, and you will see the link to their website there. They let you listen to famous poets reading their own work out loud for free, or you could even find videos or poets performing their work on YouTube and play that to your learners. At the bottom of our page, you will see a link to a specific poem on the Children's Poetry Archive. I ask that you please take the time and listen to it. Now, poetic devices. Many of these you would have seen when we discussed our short story or when we discussed literary devices in our very first study unit. Things like simile, you would have seen alliteration, you would have seen hyperbole, of course, metaphor and personification. New ones that have been added are things like onomatopoeia, oxymoron, which is not a person. It is in fact a poetic device. Idiom is another one that has been added. Please refer to your study pack for some more information on these. And then also I have included a link at the bottom of the page. Please take the time to read through that article. It not only gives a very detailed description and explanation of these poetic devices, but also it shows you how they work in poems and what they do in poems and how they actually influence the poem. So please take the time to read that article. Let us look quickly, very shortly, or in short, at some poetic devices. First of all, repetition. Now, repetition, in Afrikaans it is called herhaling, can be used for full verses. You can repeat just single lines or even just a single word or sound. And the goal is to make something stick better, to make the reader remember something better. Alliteration, you encountered alliteration, that particular device, in study unit 1 as well when we discussed literary devices. Alliteration is the phonetic alignment and repeated use of a sound or letter in the first syllable of a word, and they are usually consonants that are used in this matter. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound. The 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, remember, but it can also be a vowel sound. So it's not only the vowel letter, also letters that sound like a vowel can be repeated, and that is assonance. Similes, we also encountered this device in study unit 1. It's when you use the word like or as in a comparison. We continue with our condensed look at poetic devices, the metaphor. Remember on the previous slide, we just discussed simile now, where things are compared and you use the word like or as. A metaphor is simply a way of comparing something to another thing without using the word like or as. So a metaphors are a figurative means of comparing something to another unrelated entity in order to contrive the full meaning or impact of that something. Onomatopoeia, I must tell you, this is one of my favorite poetic devices. It is a phonetic pronunciation and sound of a word that is parallel to the word's actual meaning. Onomatopoeia is where in a poem, for example, you would use the actual sound, for example, of a car hooting. So they would actually, in the poem, the word toot toot would be there. That would be onomatopoeia. And then personification is objects that are personified by giving them human characteristics. In poems, you of course have different types of rhyme schemes, different types of rhyming. Remember, except for the haiku, which in essence is a poem where there's no rhyming. But in poems where you do find rhyming, you have rhyming deeper into the lines. So the rhyming is in the last 3, 4, even 5 syllables. Internal rhyme, this is when you rhyme words within the same line. And the outside in rhyme or enjambment, when you rhyme the end of one line with the start of the next line. This adds flow to your piece, allowing one line to seamlessly move on to the next. That is exactly why enjambment is also called run-on line. So one line flows directly into the next, and when you are using the outside-in rhyme scheme, it means that you use the end of the one line to rhyme with the beginning of the next line. We continue with rhyme schemes or different types of rhyme. You also have what is called compound rhyme. Compound rhymes are the rhyme scheme formed from 2 compound words. Remember, a compound word is where you take 2 separate words, you combine them to form a new word. So compound rhyme is where you have these 2 compound words, and both the words that you originally used to create the new word, both of them rhyme with another compound word. Look at that example, wildwood and childhood. The wild, which is a separate word that you've used, rhymes with the child, that is a separate word in that new word. Wood rhymes with hood. So both the words that have been used to create that compound word rhymes with another compound word. Then you have what is called a broken rhyme scheme, where there is no real pattern to the rhyming. There's rhyming, but there's no real pattern to it. And then the rhyming pattern could either be a couplet type of rhyme, A, A, B, B, and what that means is that line 1 and 2 would rhyme. That's where you get the A, A from. And then B, B, line 3 and 4 would rhyme again. And then line 5 and 6, C, C, and line 7 and 8, D, D would rhyme. Or it could be a sonnet type of rhyming pattern. A sonnet is a poem that has 14 lines, and within those 14 lines there could be any type of rhyme scheme. In your preparation for next week, for week 5, please work on your semester assignment. Remember, your due date is the 3rd of September, 11 o'clock at night, and submissions are already open. Work through those 3 poems in your study pack: Sunstrike, The Spider and the Fly, and The Mountain and the Squirrel. Work through them in preparation for next week. And then just on a side note, I have included some articles for you to read for your semester assignment, to assist with your semester assignment. There are some articles on Mark Twain, and then also some articles on how to write a literary analysis. Keep well during the coming week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you again next time.